All right, in this video, I'll talk about some things to consider to judge how good your operational definition is at measuring the things you're measuring. So this may be one of the most important elements in doing good research, and it's definitely behind a lot of problems in bad research. We often tend to use measures, we're tempted to use measures, that is operational definitions, that are convenient, that make it easy to collect data, even if they're not always great at really getting at the thing we're interested in. So let's talk about two things that are crucial to choosing a good measure. These are what you should look for and check in before you go forward with your own research plan. Also, important to think about when you hear about studies done by other people. So first, there's reliability. Is your way of measuring this thing consistent, basically? Like if I develop a new instrument to measure how honest someone is, will it give a wildly different result for the same person if they take it a week later or a month later? And then there's validity, which is, do the scores you're recording actually represent the variable, the construct that you're interested in? Are you really measuring what you claim to be measuring? Like, I could call my new survey a sadness instrument, but if all I'm doing is asking them to circle typos in a paragraph about flowers, I might not really be measuring sadness. And so my name for the measure, calling it a sadness instrument, might be misleading. If I tell people, I did this study about sadness and something else, right, that would mislead them. So let's dive into both of these things. Reliability and validity. Let's start with reliability. Let's say I develop a new IQ test. Kid 1 takes it and scores 80. Kid 2 takes it, they score 120. Kid 3, maybe 100, kid 4, 105. Obviously, in reality, we test like way more kids than this, right? But now imagine I come back later and I test all the same kids, but later in the school year. I retest them all, and maybe kid 1 takes it again and scores, they got an 80 before, then I got an 81. Kid 2 scores 120 now, same as before. Kid 3, a 99, that's pretty close to before. And kid 4, they get 105 again. In that case, if this is true for, all the kids we tested, a bunch of kids, I'd call that pretty reliable, pretty consistent. The high scorers at time 1 tend to be high at time 2, and those who are low before tend to be on the lower end still. Now, on the other hand, imagine we got different results. So let's say we retested those kids, and what we see is kid 1, who was low before, is now at 105, and kid 2, who was killing it before, is now below 100. Kid 3 is way higher than before. Kid 4 is much lower. Like if we see a pattern like this, again, across lots of different kids, where someone is, their score at time 1 doesn't correlate positively with their score at time 2, then it's not a reliable, not a consistent way of measuring the variable. This would be a poor IQ test because it seems to vary wildly depending on the particular day that it's taken. Someone who's actually above average could get placed in, remedial education or vice versa, just because of the random day they happen to take it on. A good analogy to understand reliability might be a clock that's 5 minutes fast. So it's still a normal clock, it's running at the normal pace, but it's just set 5 minutes fast. In that case, that kind of clock is never accurate. It'll never tell you the correct time if it's always 5 minutes fast. But it is at least consistent. So we'd say it is reliable. You could use it to time half-hour intervals or plan your drive. Think about it. If you check it at noon each day, it's always going to show you the wrong thing, right? It'll show you 12:05, but it'll always show the same thing. So we can say it's reliable. Now, there are a few different types of reliability that we might care about for a study. So I'm just going to give you a few examples. First, there's test-retest reliability. Like if I test a group of people today, and then again I test those people 3 weeks from now using the same measurement, will the same people get high scores both times? Will the same people get low scores both times? Like that's the most obvious kind of reliability. That test-retest reliability. But also, imagine you're developing a new personality scale to measure, narcissism or something. Maybe there's 40 questions on your personality scale that the participants go through, and then your scale gives them a narcissism score. We might want to also check your scale for a type of reliability we might call internal consistency. Like, if my test has a bunch of items, 40 questions or whatever, does each person score roughly the same on the first half of the questions as the second half? Are the people who score high in the first half of my narcissism questions the same people that score highest on the second half of the questions? Do they score roughly the same on the odd questions as the even ones? Basically, is the measure, the set of questions or whatever, is that reliable internally? That's what internal consistency is about. We can also, though, think about another type of reliability. Might be thinking about when it comes to our researchers. Like, imagine you're in your study, you're observing videos of marital arguments, and you're classifying spouse verbalizations as resentful or not resentful. Is your operational definition for coding a verbalization into those categories, is it reliable enough that different viewers, different researchers or research assistants that are rating the verbalizations, will they generally agree on what they see? So that last type is what we call inter-rater reliability, meaning reliability between multiple raters or observers or people coding the data, different researchers or whatever. Will two people using my operational definition generally write down the same scores when they're looking at the same situation? If they're inconsistent and tend to code the same video, they code it differently, then it's not a very reliable operational definition. So, knowing these three types of reliability, let's just see how well you can apply them. If I'm checking whether observer 1 is scoring the same phenomenon the same way that observer 2 is, what kind of reliability am I checking for? You might pause the video and try to answer first. So that one is inter-rater reliability. But what about if I'm, a human factors psychologist? I'm doing a usability study as a consultant for a tech company. Maybe I test the customer at time 1 using my fancy test, and then I go back and I test the same customer at time 2 using the same test, just to see if it still classifies them in a similar way. If I do that to see how well my customers get classified, how consistent their scores are from time 1 to time 2, what is that looking for? And that one would be test-retest reliability that we're checking. What about, though, if I'm developing some new scale with a bunch of questions on it that aims to measure inquisitiveness, say? I might do something like randomly split the questions in my big survey, my big study, split the questions into 2 halves. And I see if, when I do that, someone's score on one half of my measure corresponds to their score on the other half of my measure. I might even do that repeatedly, like go again and split the questions into different combinations, and each time compare half of the questions to the other half of the questions and see if I still find a good correspondence between what someone gets on a random set of the questions and what they get on the other random half of the questions. If it tends to always come out similar, regardless of how I mix up the questions, then we'd be satisfied with this type of reliability, which is internal consistency, right? The other type. Okay, now just thinking about basic statistics, which common statistical test is likely to help you determine these? Well, pause and see if you can think of it first. In all these cases, we're basically asking about correlation. So a simple Pearson correlation, an R value, that could give us some info on whether our participants' earlier scores match with their later scores. On internal consistency, there may be like a fancier way to calculate a correlation, like that so-called split half correlation that we just talked about a second ago. You might see it calculated as something called Cronbach's alpha. That's a common one, but it's still just looking at a type of correlation. And ditto for inter-rater reliability. We often use a fancy calculation called Cohen's kappa, but it's basically just seeing if there's a correlation between what I wrote down and what you wrote down when we saw the same thing. But now let's move on from reliability. Let's talk a little about the other side of the measurement coin, which is validity. So you can think of validity. The validity question is asking, is our operational definition for a measurement process really capturing the construct we're interested in? Are we really getting at the thing we say we are? Take a simplified example, the measuring process of using a bathroom scale, putting something on a bathroom scale and writing down the number. That is valid for measuring weight. It's a good way to do it in most cases because it's telling us about the thing we're interested in. But that same measurement process would be really crappy for capturing other constructs. Like using a bathroom scale would be invalid for measuring the volume of something. Think about a box with a volume of 5 cubic feet. You could fill it with bricks and make it really heavy, or the same box with the same volume of 5 cubic feet could be empty with nothing. So putting that on the scale, you're going to get very different numbers, even though in both cases the volume is the same, right? So in this case, yeah, that's because density differs. So in this case, you're using the wrong, process for measuring something for the variable you're actually trying to get at. Now notice, as stupid as it is to measure volume with something like a bathroom scale, that would be reliable. It wouldn't be valid, but it would be reliable, because the same object, like a 5 cubic foot box full of bricks, that same object will give the same number on my scale every time. But it's just that number doesn't tell you what you want. It's not telling you about volume. So that's the kind of thing validity is about. Is it telling you the kind of thing you want? So we'll talk now about a few different forms of validity that you want to think about when deciding if a measurement is good. First, there's what we might call face validity. Like, on the face of it, is my definition good for this construct? Does it appear to measure the thing it claims to? Think of this like almost like a sanity check, that it's not an obviously crappy definition. Consider, like, for example, measuring intelligence by counting the number of push-ups someone can do. That process of measurement, it lacks face validity for the construct intelligence. It just sucks, obviously, right? Then there's also content validity. Now, this is a way of checking that your measure covers the whole construct, not just one facet or subcomponent of it. So, for example, a scale that allegedly measures depression should ask not only about current mood, but also maybe about other aspects of depression, like lethargy or self-worth. If your measure only gets at one piece of the variable you're interested in, you are missing some content validity. Then there's criterion validity, which is asking, do scores on this measure match up, meaning correlate, with other things you would expect it to? Like, imagine you're developing a new scale to measure stress, through some survey questions. If you want to check criterion validity, you might, during your study to test it out, you might also take a cortisol sample concurrently at the same time. So when you administer your new stress scale, do these two measures correlate? Or do the participants show other signs of stress or do worse on tasks that we know stress affects? Basically, if we check something else at the same time as giving our new stress survey, we are asking concurrently. So it's called concurrent validity, or just a concurrent check of criterion validity. You might also, though, follow up with those who take your stress survey, your new stress survey that you're testing out. You might follow up. Are their scores earlier on when they took it, are those predictive of what happens later, stress-related outcomes, number of heart attacks, something like that? We might call that predictive validity. Again, just as a type of criterion validity, but now it's whether my stress scale predicts the criteria we care about. And overall, we might ask, like, do the scores on your stress survey correlate with other known measures of stress that we have? Like, if there's an existing stress scale that's widely used, does my scale, the score someone gets on it, does it correlate with the score they get on that scale? And that's a question we might call convergent validity. It's just asking if these different ways of measuring stress converge on the same basic answer for a given person. And again, these are all just ways of thinking about criterion validity. All of these are just ways of testing if the scores match up with other things you would expect it to match up with if it's capturing the construct of stress. And finally, there's also what we might call discriminant validity. You want to make sure your measurement process isn't accidentally measuring something else, like some other related but distinct or theoretically distinct concept. Like, your measure should not be too highly correlated with tests that are designed to measure something else, some theoretically different concept. For example, your new measure of narcissism shouldn't correlate precisely with existing scales measuring self-esteem, assuming that self-esteem and narcissism are theoretically different entities. At that point, you might actually just be measuring self-esteem and not narcissism if the scores on your new narcissism scale are really just the same as what someone gets on self-esteem. Or here's another example. Imagine we've got some psychological theories about, say, self-esteem as one construct, but maybe something else like locus of control is a new construct that a lot of psychologists have been thinking and talking about. That's, if you don't know of it, that's where you feel a sense of agency over your life, like a sense that you've got some control over outcomes in your life, compared to someone who might feel like they're at the mercy of external forces. I might want to argue that, yeah, these are theoretically distinct concepts, right? I think locus of control is this real thing, this new thing that's different than self-esteem. But maybe others in the community initially are skeptical, and someone's been arguing with me that I'm really just measuring self-esteem in my new locus of control studies. Well, I could find some existing measures of self-esteem, like the three scales or instruments of self-esteem that you see here. I might compare people's results on that to, I don't know, those same people if they take some locus of control measures that I developed to quantify locus of control. In that case, I could simply run a correlation for each participant between, all the combinations of things, and they took, if they took all 6 of these tests, look at the correlation between the results of those tests. If we write it out in a table like this, it's called a correlation matrix. So you'll notice that the first self-esteem measure correlates with itself perfectly. That's a 1.0. And the second self-esteem measure, that correlates with the first and the third one pretty highly at 0.83 and 0.85. So as expected, if they're measuring the same thing, they correlate together. The self-esteem measures correlate together. Great. But notice they don't correlate with my new measures, which I'm claiming are what I'm calling locus of control measures. And indeed, the locus of control measures, they all do correlate together. So it suggests that, yeah, I'm measuring the same thing with those, but the fact that they don't correlate with measures of self-esteem is a good argument that I'm getting at something distinct here. I can go back to the skeptic and say, no, you're wrong. My new studies aren't just measuring self-control. I've got a truly distinct concept here. In that case, I've shown discriminant validity. I've shown that we can discriminate between the two concepts, in this case, statistically. So the big picture takeaway here is just that the operational definition that we use to measure any construct should be reliable, meaning consistent, and we should have some reason to think that it's actually measuring that construct. In other words, that it's valid as well. So when thinking about these two aspects of measurement, you'll often see an analogy of a dartboard. On the far left here, you can see the idea of something being kind of reliable, like they're consistently hitting the same spot, but it's sure not valid. They're hitting the wrong thing. Next to that, you could imagine that the second one here, something might sort of average out to validity, average out to the thing we're trying to get at, but it's so incredibly unreliable that you really wouldn't want to count on any given shot or measurement to get the target you're hoping for. Of course, something could also be neither reliable nor valid, like in the third example here. It's inconsistent, so it's unreliable since the shots could end up in wildly different places, but it's also clustered around the wrong area entirely. Whereas what we want, what we're hoping for, is like the one on the far right here, the last one, a measure that's both reliable and hitting what we wanted to hit, so also valid. Now, before we finish this video, I just wanted to give a real-life example that you may have run into before. Let's talk about the rather unscientific, quote-unquote, personality test that most of us have run into or taken at some point in our lives, the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, or MBTI for short. People put in their dating profiles. It's an incredibly popular, quote-unquote, personality test. It's used by businesses to screen employees to make decisions on whether to hire someone or not. Like literally 89 of the top Fortune 100 companies use it. It's used by over 10,000 companies that we know of, more than 2,500 colleges, and at least 200 government agencies in the US. Now, you know who doesn't use the MBTI? Psychologists, because it's actually a really crappy measure of personality. If you've never seen it before, you basically answer a bunch of questions and then it sorts you like a Harry Potter sorting hat into one of 16 categories by categorizing you on these 4 different bipolar scales. Like, whether it classifies you as an extrovert or an introvert, a thinker versus a feeler, things like that. So with those 4 categories, those 4 scales, that'll lead to 16 possible combinations, which then they have some vague, kind of totally made up, happy little descriptions for each one. And people love this stuff. They eat it up. You can see how it's fun in the same way that classifying yourself into a Harry Potter house can be a fun little game. But it is not a real personality test, and it is not scientifically supported. Indeed, it was developed by a couple of non-scientists who were just obsessed with psychodynamic theorist Carl Jung who is like a super interesting thinker, but not scientific. And there is a huge conflict of interest here, since it's a for-profit company that sells these tests, making $20 million per year off of it, probably more now. So no wonder they don't want to test whether it's actually reliable or valid. They are making bank pretending it's a real thing. Now, meanwhile, psychologists at universities have run real scientific studies to check the psychometric properties of the test to see if it's any good as a measure of personality. And sadly, the results aren't great. So first off, it's got really crappy reliability, like really bad. As in, testing the exact same person just a few weeks later, we find that half of the people get a totally different result. Like, oh, you think you're an INFP personality, huh? I wouldn't put much stock in that, since in a couple weeks it'll say you're something else. But also, it doesn't fit how modern scientific psychologists see personality. Like, the way it works, it's totally binary. You get lumped into one category or the other on each of those 4 scales. But things aren't like that. People aren't like that. Most people tend to be kind of towards the middle of the spectrum on things like, I don't know, introversion to extroversion. It's kind of like a normal curve, a bell curve, which means most people who get placed into one of those categories or the other, they were actually super close to being in the opposite category. It's not very distinct, in fact, from someone who just happened to land on, just the other side of the cutoff this particular week. So that's a crappy way to sort people on things that are more of a spectrum than a yes-no binary. Meanwhile, when we do statistical factor analysis, the MBTI, it doesn't actually break out into distinguishing 4 factors as the whole system claims and is based on. So the questions on the test, when we test them statistically, don't actually lead to a 4-factor model. So this would never be accepted in real psychometrics. Meanwhile, it also lacks predictive validity. Like, despite how much they say it helps determine what profession you'd be good for, and people use it for that, when we actually measure people's types on the test and then what profession they're in, there is no correlation. It doesn't predict what someone does. And all of this is just the start of the criticism of the MBTI bullshit. So, the conclusion by pretty much every psychologist: this is not a valid or reliable measure of personality. It sucks. It's for entertainment value only. Indeed, the Army Research Institute, they looked into it because the military uses this stuff, and they concluded it should not be used for career counseling. As they said, there's, quote, no evidence for the utility of the test. So why is it so popular? Why is Myers-Briggs so popular? Probably because, in a sense, it kind of flatters. It accentuates the positive. No matter what category it labels you, you win. You sound special and interesting. And we'll talk later about this idea more, but it's basically convincing, I think, because of what's called the Forer effect, or the Barnum effect, you might have heard. After P.T. Barnum, the circus showman who promoted a lot of hoaxes, the Forer effect is where a description of your personality, or your horoscope, or whatever, it's when that thing feels accurate and specifically about you, even when it's really just a vague, generic description that could fit most anyone. Like, in a classic psychology experiment, this psychologist named Forer, who it's named after, this psychologist gave his students what they thought was a personality test. So they fill this thing out, they give it to him, he goes away for a week, he comes back a week later with everyone's results to give them back their personalized results. So he hands them an envelope, everyone's handed their results to read, and they're asked to mark down how accurate their personality test was. But secretly, everyone in the room got the same results, the exact same summary about their personality from his fake little test. So they were all given the same 13 statements that were so vague they could apply to pretty much anyone. Like, you have a great need for other people to like and admire you. You have a tendency to be critical of yourself. You have a great deal of unused capacity, which you have not turned to your advantage. Well, you have some personality weaknesses, you're generally able to compensate for them. Or at times you're extroverted, affable, sociable, while at other times you're introverted, wary, and reserved. Some of your aspirations tend to be pretty unrealistic, and so on. So 13 statements like this, pretty general and vague, stuff that pretty much anyone could say describes them to at least some extent. So sure enough, the students thought it was a very accurate personality test. They rated it as being very accurate about them, as kind of capturing them, until they were told at the end it was a trick. It was just a bunch of vague statements that were given, the exact same statements, to everyone. And everyone thought, oh yeah, this describes me. It's personal to me. No, we just have a tendency, a cognitive bias, to think these things are specific to us when they're not. Same thing with so-called psychics using tricks to do what are called cold readings, or with astrology crap like horoscopes. They are written in such a way that you could stretch it to kind of fit and feel accurate no matter what ends up happening, which means they are useless as real predictions. But we humans, we're gullible enough to be convinced they have some truth that, even when they don't. The same thing is likely what's going on with fake personality tests like the Myers-Briggs. It doesn't have genuine reliability or validity, which are the things we'd want as a scientific measure of personality. It's just fun, and it's vague enough that anyone can feel it applies to them in a personal way. Anyway, that's enough for reliability and validity for now. It's something we'll want to keep in mind anytime that we're brainstorming how to measure the variables in a new study, but also something to consider when reading about a study in the news or when dissecting a peer-reviewed journal article. Ask yourself, is there any evidence that the way they're measuring things is reliable and valid? Sometimes a peer-reviewed article will tell you that they used a standard and common scale to measure one of their variables. Maybe they'll mention it's a psychometrically validated scale. Maybe they'll provide some citations to that as evidence. You could look into that. Perhaps they'll even include, Cronbach's alpha, or they'll tell you Cohen's kappa to judge how well their raters agreed when independently rating some behavior. Those kinds of details matter. Those kinds of details can help you be more confident that the study is actually measuring the variables it's talking about. But also, always just use your own common sense and think about things like the face validity too. If someone's doing the equivalent of measuring volume on a bathroom scale, take their results with a grain of salt.